Thank you to Kenya Academy for this invitation and for this most interesting masterclass session, which I believe is very timely also. What I wanted to do, also because we've already listened to an expert journalist and an academic that presented very interesting discourses just now. I wanted to do several things. One is to map and identify corruption in Southeast Asia, which means beyond our country borders. But what is it that constitutes regional corruption or cross-border corruption? And what is it that we need to be concerned about as investigative journalists and as investigators in the fight against corruption, in turning the tide against corruption? So we know that Southeast Asia is a very vulnerable region, very dynamic region, and it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But we also know that safeguards, institutional structures to look at better accountability and accountable governance is probably one of the weaker regions in the world. So we need to actually look at better investigations, paper trail, evidence-based, and real investigative work. So I'm actually happy to present a couple of case studies, which I hope will be impetus for many investigative journalists among yourselves to start writing and perhaps probe deeper and dig deeper and to see what kind of tools that we have available. So what I'd also like to do is to look at the cross-linking factors between business and politics, cross-linking factors between transnational crime and how it interfaces with corruption, and whether corruption actually fuels and facilitates cross-border crimes, cross-border criminal activities, and crimes which are transnational in nature. So this is just an overview of geography and a location of Southeast Asia and where we are today, and all the different countries and some of the maritime borders that also have many issues related to corruption. So in moving forward, I think a very important thing that we need to probably situate this discussion is to look at ASEAN itself. Now, if many of us have already been familiar with writing about ASEAN and knowing about its mode of operations, we could be critical about its lax ways of moving forward. It's very cautious about not getting into each other's domestic politics. It's a very focused bloc on regional trade advancement, and sometimes other issues like human rights, security issues, and all that are many issues that become frustrating as we try to discuss. But having said all that, there's something very important also that we need to recognize, that ASEAN has also evolved and grown and known that it has to come together. It has to have its act together if it wants to be relevant trading bloc in the region. So there's an ASEAN Charter now, and there's three important pillars, one of which that I want to highlight today is the political security blueprint. And the other one is the ASEAN Economic Community, and then the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Pillar. And all these three are commitments of ASEAN to actually develop an ASEAN community vision for 2025. So we are in 2021 now, and it looks like there are a few years before us to actually look at how to turn the tide on corruption in Southeast Asia. But as I was digging through, I found something interesting on the ASEAN Political Security Blueprint, which all of our governments had actually signed on. So if you look at A2.3, there are several commitments that our ASEAN governments have made. One of it is to implement the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed back in 2004, and that is to prevent and combat corruption, to look at the Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance. This is really important in criminal matters and corruption matters that involve more than one country. And we can actually share a lot from the lessons learned from the 1MDB scandal. And we can promote ASEAN cooperation within the UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which all 10 ASEAN member states have actually signed. So these are actually tools for us to use in calling out our governments, in actually ensuring that some commitments get realized, or how we can actually push and mobilize further. Intensify corruption, anti-corruption efforts now as a region. And very interestingly, recently there is a pact formed called the Southeast Asia Parties Against Corruption, in which ASEAN member states have actually committed to develop a greater capacity building, training for governments, law enforcement, etc., on how to fight corruption, promote the ASEAN integrity dialogue, and so on. I'm putting this because I think we also need to remind ourselves that there are documents like this in Southeast Asia among ASEAN countries, and these are probably very important tools for us to move forward in how we want to develop better collaboration and investigative journalism as we talk about corruption in Southeast Asia and how we can hold our governments to account for all their actions at country level and at the sub-regional level of ASEAN. So here is what I was hoping to do, is to introduce some cross-border issues, which does not involve just one country. It involves definitely more than one country and sometimes many other countries in the ASEAN region. So the first picture on the left is probably something that most of our countries suffer from, which is an issue of natural resource governance, an issue of forest governance, and illegal logging that quite rampantly takes place. It definitely happens in Indonesia. It definitely happens in Malaysia, in the Philippines, and many other countries because of our rich tropical forests. The picture below is something that is hotting up now. We are completely overwhelmed, completely inspired by the collaboration and investigative expose of the Panama Papers. First, that was a couple of years ago, and very recently, just a couple of weeks, the Pandora Papers, which highlights so many Southeast Asian countries, apart from countries in the world, on illicit financial flows, on tax evasion, on how the uber rich actually evade paying taxes at home, but enrich their wealth through the shadow economy in offshore islands using unscrupulous means like shell companies and various other issues that the Pandora Papers had actually helped us digest a bit better and help us realize how it has actually impacted so many of our countries in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, the picture on the right is something that we see all the time. It's ships of stateless people, refugees trying to seek refuge in some of our shores. And many Rohingya communities have actually died as a result of all these. Now, these are cross-country issues, cross-border issues, and there are many, many more. But what I wanted to highlight are some of these details and case studies that will actually make very important investigative writing. And it's really all about data, all about trying to digest how much we can analyze around what ASEAN needs to do. Okay, so this is what I was actually talking about, some of the other examples of transnational crimes fueled by corruption. One very important case study that I'd like to highlight is the import of plastic waste. I've touched a little bit on illegal logging, illicit financial flows, and then we come to a couple more rather serious transnational crimes affecting the ASEAN region, like drug trafficking, which is very rampant in Myanmar, and how it affects its neighboring countries, for example, Thailand and also Malaysia. Illicit trade, This is actually very interesting because the illicit trade is actually growing the shadow economy in Southeast Asia. So we talk about illicit trade, we're talking about illicit cigarettes, illicit alcohol, many types of goods that are moving across borders without actually going through the proper channels. And of course, issues of natural resource governance that I talked about. Now, on the right-hand side, I wanted to show some of the key characteristics that the ASEAN member states share. And many of us have either a current autocratic government or a history with autocratic leadership. And this has actually helped to fuel corrupt practices. Political instability that is currently affecting countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. And the pandemic, I think it's very important to note how corruption has actually flourished along with the pandemic. And with that, we also know it's also because of low levels of accountability, a very politicized public sector, and very corrupt law enforcement much of the time. We have some examples, of course, where this has improved over time, like in the case of Indonesia, but it has also been stopped from being fully independent. But in Malaysia, we have tons of examples of how the law enforcement, including the police and the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, are themselves also saddled with corrupt officials and so on. And another very interesting and important issue, which I will highlight in the next slides, is really about political financing and how political financing is creating corruption, not just within countries to win elections, but it is also corrupting the region because of illicit financial flows and suspicious donors from foreign sources to actually fuel decisions of how elections can be won by different countries and who should win elections, etc. So we have poor whistleblower protection all along, and definitely protection for investigative journalists is something that we need to discuss as we go along. Okay. Now, this was earlier shared by Taz on the Corruption Perception Index in the country. This is just something for us to take note that most of the countries in the ASEAN region fall from number 50 and below. And so that actually speaks very strongly of the need for better collaborative investigative work to connect the dots and mainly to follow the money and to actually see where it actually lands up, to track illicit enrichment and so on. Okay. Here are some figures on the impact of corruption on doing business. I picked up a couple of details from the World Bank Enterprise Survey carried out in 2019. This was before the pandemic, of course. And it was quite startling, really, to look at the issue of procurement, the issue of public procurement, where 43.5%, according to the World Bank, of businesses, whether they are SMEs or larger businesses, including multinationals, were actually expected to give gifts to secure government contracts in Southeast Asia. And what was prevalent in the region is also crony capitalism, personal connections, and political patronage, which was actually leading how access to government contracts and lucrative economic resources are actually dished out, as opposed to meritorious companies trying to bid for a multi-million-dollar contract and so on. So it is all about who you know rather than what you can do and what kind of experience you bring into the system. So this is a huge problem in many of the Southeast Asian countries, and it is something that needs urgent reform and something which is, I think, structural much more than cultural, although we can argue that culturally people feel receiving gifts is just normal because this is how Asians are. You know, you appreciate somebody for doing you a favor, and so you give them a gift. Now, there are big differences between buying flowers than buying an expensive Rolex watch, or buying edible food as opposed to providing golf club memberships and houses and land for free and etc. And gift giving has always been a problem in which fuels bribery and corruption. So when is it that you draw the line between whether the gift is a bribe and whether the gift is a reward for allowing for licenses, tenders to be given out? It's a huge problem where procurement has actually bled the system of many countries. So with that has also been the evolution of the growth of illicit trade. I mentioned cigarettes and alcohol just now, but I think there are many, many other contraband items, and it gets more serious when we talk about the smuggling of people, the smuggling of drugs, and many issues which link to transnational crime. So with that, I wanted to take us to the next issue. So to think about how corruption actually shackles and jeopardizes doing business in ASEAN. And this might be a very important advocacy approach for us to give real evidence and data to governments when we are advocating for better governance, accountable governance, better democracy with ASEAN governments, that if you don't plug corruption or turn the tide against corruption, businesses would probably leave the region and go invest somewhere where it might be more enabling. So it could actually work in the favor of businesses to support turning the tide against corruption. So here is another example on the import of plastic waste. This was rather shocking because we discovered that Malaysia was now importing plastic waste for recycling and many other industrial purposes. So the countries that were exporting to Malaysia and to Indonesia and several other countries in the region were Western democracies like the United States, Canada, the European Union, shockingly quite ignoring their own domestic policies at home and just exporting waste to less developed countries, all because China in 2018, under the National Sword Policy, started to ban 24 types of solid waste imports, including plastic, paper waste, etc. So what happened was a global disruption for the market for recyclable material, and they redirected plastic waste to Southeast Asia. And suddenly we started to get complaints. The center that I lead started to get complaints from residents in small towns like Sungai Petani, Jenjarom, Klang, and even in Butterworth, that they were becoming victims of illegal factories burning plastics. And it was because of this that we started to launch our own investigation. So the organization that I work with actually does investigative reporting. We are not a journalist organization, but we believe that the only way to call out corruption is to get the facts, to follow the trail, the paper trail, the money, etc. And then it opened another Pandora box of worms where we realized that there was some law enforcement agencies. In this case, I think it's very interesting to look at customs and how customs was actually a very central agency that needed to answer many questions over how plastic waste was actually brought into the country and why so many factories were illegally setting up. So if you look at the picture on the left, this is infographics that we created to help Malaysians actually understand why this was becoming a problem. And that we became the top destination in 2018 for plastic waste exports. So 754,000 tons of plastic waste was imported into Malaysia in 2018. By 2019, Malaysian authorities decided then finally to take action after some campaigns and advocacy and people actually banging on the doors of the domestic trade and consumer affairs and also the housing ministry, etc., including the environment ministry, decided to send back about a few hundred tons of plastic waste back to the sending countries, and closed down about 170 illegal recycling factories. So all of this was launched in a report. We put together an investigative report on plastic waste coming from Western countries and infiltrating countries in Southeast Asia because China had suddenly banned the imports of plastic waste into their country. So the impact here is local to global, global to local. And the Southeast Asian region was then filled with rubbish, so to speak. And it was a situation in which we were unable to actually manage, because then we found that APs were actually given to some companies to allow for the imports of plastic waste. And this was really quite devastating because of many of the local councils that were in charge of allowing companies to operate, etc., started to say that they were powerless because the instructions were coming from the federal government to allow these companies to operate, including closing an eye to many other illegal operations that were taking place. So it was a very, very important issue to address. So we actually wrote to the European Anti-Fraud Office to lodge a complaint. And we were really glad that the European Anti-Fraud Office had picked up the investigations, and then they had issued compounds and summons to some of the European Union factories that were exporting plastic waste into Malaysia. So there was some success here and there on the issue of advocacy to return plastic waste and to remove it from many of the ports in our country. Okay, the next issue is the issue on natural resource governance. And I think this is another very big issue, which is a Southeast Asian cross-border issue, because we find that this region is very rich in natural resources. For example, in Myanmar, there was a report that actually looked at jade extraction, where 90% of the world's jade actually comes from Myanmar. And it was extracted in very perilous situations where, of course, the political situation was also weak. And it came from the Kachin state, where many refugees have left the situation because of the military presence and the violence that have taken place. There have been some very successful advocacies because of investigative work by journalists and by civil society groups in the Philippines and in Indonesia to subscribe to EITI's criteria for natural resource governance. But it is a growing problem because whether it's about mining, whether it's about coal or jade or gold, etc., it has devastating impact on the environment. And this is something that we probably can find a lot of interesting case studies to look at how investigative journalism can call out the stakeholders and the actors, and how people who live on the environment, like the Orang Asli communities and the indigenous communities, are directly impacted because large companies are coming in to our countries from outside to actually reap the profits from the whole area of natural resources. Okay. The next of the issues is the Pandora Papers that has been highlighted a few times already. But I wanted to take some time so that we can understand what are the issues that we need to look out for in the Southeast Asian region, and what is it that was so successful about the consortium of investigative journalists that actually looked at so many country leaders, political leaders, as well as business leaders that were caught literally with their pants down on how they had actually first evaded paying tax in their home countries and started to invest in secret jurisdictions around shell companies, and a very important other area which is connected so much to transnational crimes and corruption, which is the issue of money laundering. And all of our countries and their leaders have very rich histories. Not all of our leaders, most of our leaders have very rich histories of how they have laundered money, because money laundering is simple to understand, but it's very complicated in its exercise, where you place illicitly obtained funds into legal entities. So it gets washed, like in a washing machine, it gets laundered so that it can be reinvested into real estate, into diamond, gems, very high-end type of property, so that it cannot ever be traced where the source of the money is coming from. So that is why in the SDG goal 16.4 is on actually trying to stop illicit financial flows from developing countries. Southeast Asia, and in particular Malaysia, scored really badly because we were number 5 from the bottom of the list in allowing for capital flight and money to leave the country. So if there were laws to track illicit enrichment, which we don't have, this is something that investigative journalists can actually work on in their countries that actually do have that. Like in the Philippines, I understand that you do have a law on tracking illicit enrichment, and also in Cambodia under your anti-corruption law. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but from what I have read and talked to friends in these countries, there are some of us that actually have asset declaration laws and tracking illicit enrichment. It would be really, really important to look at what is a legitimate investment, what is not, who are those that are cheating the system, etc. Now, there's one more area, which is asset recovery. This is something we learned from the 1MDB scandal, and or when there was that monumental change of government in 2018 in our country. I was given the opportunity to sit in the 1MDB investigation committee, and then we realized that out of that, the billions that were stolen, and how Najib and his gang of thieves had actually stolen so much of the money, that the money laundering was so difficult to trace. And how then do you recover the assets? Because you don't know what was a legitimate investment, what was a bogus investment, and how do you actually call for, if you remember my first slide on the political security blueprint, it was about mutual legal assistance as well, and how we actually need to get our different legal jurisdictions to also start cooperating together. So there's huge scope to write about this, because there's so little understanding about why countries need to solve corruption by looking at legal mechanisms, by looking at following the paper trail, and definitely following the money. Okay, I have put the criminal activity again to remind us that when we talk about turning the tide on corruption, we're actually talking about bringing criminals to justice. Corruption is a crime. And many of our countries actually have laws that criminalize corruption. But because of the issue of poor accountable governance, corrupt law enforcement, etc., oftentimes corruption manifests itself in so many complicated layers that it becomes very, very difficult to find evidence, very difficult to actually get the sender and the receiver, for example, to actually speak. And how do you actually get witnesses to testify in corruption trials that they had partaken in different criminal activity and so on. So for those investigative journalists among you that cover court cases, you'd understand the complexity in actually getting corrupt offenders to speak and to testify, unless they get changed from suspects to become crown witnesses in actually allowing for many different corruption scandals to be resolved at the court level. So this is something else for us to actually look at and to discuss. Okay, I just have 2 or 3 more slides. And one other big area that I wanted to highlight is the issue of political financing, money politics, and political parties in Southeast Asia. And one very salient feature in common for political parties that we know, whatever country that we're in, is that they generate and handle enormous amounts of money and have deep roots and tentacles within the economy and business sector. So this is what I wanted to highlight. Another nexus that is so important for investigative journalists to write about, which is the cross-linking relationship between politics and business, and how businesses sometimes, because of their enormous influence and resources, can actually determine who wins elections, which political parties get funded more than the others, and how they also can hide the sources of their donations. Now, in Malaysia, the whole issue of donation, ever since the 1MDB especially, have become a huge issue for definition. What is a donation? And the kind of conduits that are used for donations to be made by business entities, by corporates making donations via foundations, via associations, and via government-linked companies or state-owned enterprises in order to rechannel that money for a political event or to actually fund a particular political leader. And this has been something which has been prevalent. It's not a new problem, but it's just getting so much more complex because political parties are also using secret means of hiding how donations are actually brought into the party. And on some occasions, as we learned in the 1MDB scandal, many of the political party leaders in UMNO, for example, had no idea that the donations were coming from 1MDB money, the dirty 1MDB money. And in fact, one of the political leaders was actually charged for not declaring to the income tax the source of where that money was coming from. Because the money came from the prime minister, he just thought it's money for political activity, so he accepted it without even knowing where the source of the money was coming from. So the Political Financing Act will resolve a number of things. One is to actually have an independent controller that will be the point person, and it has to be independent, which means there cannot be executive interference on who this person or institution is, to actually record all donations and make transparent which donations is coming from where and for which political party. Now, the other advocacy that I feel we need to develop following all these different paper trail is how to look at state funding that I understand Indonesia is already practicing it, state funding for political parties, and how through our investigations we can find if state funding can actually reduce corruption in political parties, because money politics and political financing is really the mother of all corruption. It is something that just makes it so difficult to make political parties accountable, because political parties need money to run their activities, but the entire problem lies with illicit sources of funding and with political intentions on allowing different types of parties to win different elections. Okay, so this is it. 1MDB scandal taught us many things. It was all things grand on corruption. And it wasn't just a Malaysia problem. Of course, it was a Malaysia inspired problem, but it involved other Southeast Asian countries as well. So this is an excellent case of why we need to join forces. It involved Singapore. And as much as we talk about how the Department of Justice in the US had actually led the investigations and all that, Singapore, through its monetary authority in Singapore, had actually started investigations on the banks and the bankers, the merchant banks that were in Singapore, in which the money was laundered via 1MDB. They began the investigation and they jailed some of their bankers first. So this is quite remarkable, really. And I think we need to really look at how we can understand the financial system in the country. Not that I'm praising Singapore or anything. I mean, they're the biggest financial hub for money laundering, etc. But these are the kind of things we need to crack. And then we had Thailand, which was housing Justo, the main whistleblower of the 1MDB scandal. And then he was found out and the Thai authorities took action and sent him back to Switzerland, in which he had to go through several issues and all that. And he spent some time in the Thai prisons as well. And then Indonesia for seizing the Equanimity, the big luxury yacht, and then how the asset was recovered after there was mutual legal cooperation between the Malaysia government after the change of government between Indonesia and Malaysia, and how that yacht was brought back and the assets were actually returned. So this is an excellent case of cross-border corruption, an excellent case of why investigative journalists were so critically primary in uncovering and exposing corruption scandal, without which we would never have had a change of regime. We would never have had, of course, this current political instability and everything that Malaysia is not very used to in terms of politics. But I wanted to end it here by suggesting a few things on what we can do as journalists in the region. So it was also suggested by Tess just now that we need maybe to do a little bit more research and work on how to develop an investigative journalist network, which I think has so many issues to uncover and has a large scope, either through an existing alliance or some new initiative, which Kenya Academy might want to also explore, and to look at how we could also collaborate with the Southeast Asia parties against corruption and some of the issues that we wanted to highlight, and investigative journalism that will be a central component of how data can be released for transnational crimes in Southeast Asia. And then for civil society, how civil society can actually work with the investigative journalists to develop more investigative reporting, evidence-based data, and to push for data transparency. Data-driven type of advocacy targeting an ASEAN Community 2025, so that the promise of an ASEAN integrity dialogue is not just something that they pay lip service to, but would be quite serious to actually take some action. And finally, to assist the governments, if they ever wanted to accept the assistance, on pushing evidence-based information on what ASEAN needs to change, focus, develop around the Southeast Asia Pact Against Corruption. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is the issue of technology in turning the tide against corruption, which I think we didn't really touch on earlier, is the use of things like blockchain technology, machine reading, artificial intelligence, etc., that can help to expose corruption. So blockchain is extremely useful in, say, procurement systems, where you actually get a digitized Excel sheets to track the entire process of how a particular project wins a bid, and so on and so forth. And to get, of course, technical assistance from UNODC, the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, mainly to look at government commitments around the UN Convention Against Corruption and the UN Transnational Organized Crime Convention, which has 3 protocols also all on transnational crime. So one is on the flow and smuggling of migrants. The other is on weapons. So all these make very critical information. I mean, you may contact us for further details because we are actually working on some of these issues quite actively. As you figure out your projects and how you actually want to structure your investigative writing, I will be very happy to work with you and Kinney Academy on this. So thank you very much.